Well, good morning. It's good to be in Columbus and to see all of you again. I was here back in the spring. It just seems like it was yesterday in some ways, but it was actually, I think, back in April. I was here and just enjoyed my week with all of you and the chance to be back today. And I'm sorry again, my dad couldn't be here, and he sends his apologies to you. As I stated in the class, he hasn't been feeling well the last few days, and so he coughed a lot during the night, and he just got up this morning. He said, I just don't know that I'm up to going. And for my dad to say that, he's got to really be sick. He doesn't miss many preaching appointments, especially in his youth at age 93. But otherwise, he's doing very well. So I pulled the elder son card and made him stay in and stay home today and just rest. We're glad to have all of you. There's visitors here, and I've met some visitors from the community, and that's wonderful. Thank you for coming and being a part of our assembly this morning. Our assembly is very simple. I mean, we're not trying to impress anybody. We're just singing together and praying together and praising together, and that's what Christians do. And remembering why the first day is the first day as we partake of the Lord's Supper and remember the death of Jesus. How can we ever forget that? In fact, God said, don't forget that. This do in remembrance of me, he said. So we've done that this morning, and I'm just glad to be a part of such a good group of folks. And if you're visiting here, you're with a good group of folks. And they'll be friendly, and they'll love you and take care of you and encourage you. And I appreciate that about all of you. I'm glad Terry White's here. I'm even glad for that. Even though she gives me grief. When she and my wife Julie get together, you ever been to a roast? You ever seen a roast where there's some poor fella sitting there, and everybody gets up and talks about it and makes fun of it, you know? And everybody just laughs and laughs. Well, I could sell tickets. When she and Julie get together, I could sell tickets because they roast me really good. And but I'm going to take the high road. It's okay. It's all right. Turn to John chapter 6, if you will. I want to talk about something in the life of Jesus that it's one of the scenes that it always just resonates with me. And it's that text that Greg read to us moments ago of Jesus feeding the 5,000. You know, when Jesus worked miracles, all of the miracles of Jesus were amazing. They were, every one of them, awe-inspiring. And in some ways, when Jesus worked a miracle, people being people then, just like people now, I'm sure people saw this and scratched their heads and said, how did he do that? How did he do that? Well, you and I know the answer to that. He did every one of these miracles because he is God and God can do anything. You open your Bible to the very first chapter, and God says, let there be light. And suddenly every component arrangement of this great effervescence that we call light just happened. Why? Because he spoke and it was done. Psalm 33 and verse 6, Psalm 33 and verse 9 says that. He spoke, done. That's power. Man may have great power. And I think of the power that man has shown in the inventions in areas of medicine and technology and engineering and all of those kinds of things. But there's no power, ladies and gentlemen, like the miraculous power of God to make something out of nothing. You know, man simply discovers. God creates. I think of Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 3, when it says, the earth was created so that it was made not out of the things that are visible. Only God can do that. Only God can create something out of nothing. Anybody remember David Copperfield? Anybody remember Copperfield? He was a magician, remember? And I have seen David Copperfield do some things that it's just head scratching. How did he do that? Well, we understand that there is a big difference between magic and miracle. The difference between sleight of hand and power of God. When I read in Genesis chapter 1, let there be light, that's no sleight of hand. That's the power of God. When I read in John chapter 6 of Jesus feeding 5,000 people, that's no sleight of hand. That's the power of God. So concerning were the miracles of Jesus that the enemies of Jesus conspired together and they said, if we let this man continue on this way, all men are going to believe in him. Did you notice they didn't discount the miracles? They didn't deny them. They were jealous of them because they didn't have that power. Only Jesus did. And it says in John 11 and verse 53, from that day on, they conspired together to kill him. But back to John chapter 6 and this feeding of the 5,000. Verse 1 begins with these words. I have the New American Standard Version, and it begins with these words, after these things. Do you know that's John's keynote statement that he uses a lot to keep the narrative moving? Writers do that. Every writer's a little bit different in how he crafts that and how he does that. But when a writer writes, he writes in such a way that he wants to keep you engaged. You ever read a book and you finish one chapter and you're like, oh man, I got to read another one. He ends one chapter just with an invitation. You got to keep on reading. And that's how the gospel writers write. But they're all different. Mark's keynote word is immediately. When you read through Mark's gospel, you will see the word immediately, immediately, immediately. What is he doing? He's keeping the narrative moving. When John writes, he says, after these things, after these things, after these things. What is he doing? He's keeping the narrative moving. He's keeping you engaged. Back to chapter 5 and verse 1. After these things. Look at chapter 7 and verse 1. After these things. Now, I know what you're going to do. You're going to look at chapter 8. It says, well, it doesn't say that there. Well, okay. But it says that all through the chapter divisions are man-made. I hope you know that. All through John's account, he's going to say, after these things, after these things, after these things. Now, don't start going through their account. Do that at home this afternoon. But that's John's way to keep it moving, to keep you engaged. Here's the point. Jesus was with these 12 men a little over 3 years. And we have 4 books that tell us about Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to give us the biographical information about Jesus. And out of 3+ years, occasionally the Holy Spirit pulls back the curtain and gives us a peek at a day in the life of Jesus. But when you come to the Gospel of John, here's what's interesting. John only talks about 20 days out of over 3 years that Jesus was with these 12 men. Out of over 1,000 days, John only pulls back the curtain to show us 20 of them. So when you get to the end of John, in John chapter 20, and verse 30 and verse 31, therefore many other signs Jesus performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written. And what's the purpose? That you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Go to chapter 21 and verse 25. Last verse. There are also many other things which Jesus did. which, if they were written in detail, I suppose that not even the world itself would contain the words therein. John only gives us 20 days. 20 days. But that's enough to make his case. But back to John 6. Verse 1 says, after these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. The Sea of Galilee is a real place. But it's not a sea like we think, sea, ocean. That's not it at all. Sometimes the Sea of Galilee is called Lake Gennesaret. Because the Sea of Galilee is a big lake. It's 13 miles long. It is 8 miles across. And if you're into topography, the really neat thing about the Sea of Galilee is that it's 680 feet below sea level, which is the perfect storm for perfect storms. But those are in some other texts. And so Jesus gets in a boat with his men, and they go across the Sea of Galilee. And verse 2 says, a large crowd followed him. Why? Because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. Matthew's account tells us that by this time the word about Jesus was spreading to everyone. And people were coming from Judea and Galilee, and as far away as Syria, they were coming to him. They were hearing the news that Jesus could work miracles that nobody else could do. And so they were coming. But verse 3 says, then Jesus went up onto the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now, between verses 2 and verse 3, there is a back story that John doesn't tell us, but Matthew does. So hold your finger here in John 6 and go to Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13. Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13. When Jesus heard about John the Baptizer. Remember Herod, go back in the earlier verses, chapter 14, verse 10. Herod sent and had John beheaded, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother, and his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and they went and reported to Jesus. Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. That's the backstory. Imagine getting the news that the one person who knows you better than anybody else hasn't just passed away. They've been killed. They've been murdered. And Jesus living in the flesh, it was a very sad occasion. And he needs time to be alone. He needs time to think. He needs time to grieve. He needs time to spend time with the 12. And so they get in a boat and they cross the Sea of Galilee. Jesus needed time alone, away from all of these people who've been following him. You ever need time like that? You ever need time when you just need to get alone? Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. Do you ever have a week that's just crazy? And you're thinking, if I can just get to Saturday, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to rest. I'm just going to take it easy. And so Saturday morning comes. Finally you get there, and you're already exhausted from a crazy, crazy week. And Saturday morning comes, and it's 8 o'clock, and you're still working on your first cup of coffee. It's 8 o'clock, and all of a sudden, on your door. And it's your neighbor. And he says, I know you're pretty good at helping fix stuff. He said, I've got a little plumbing problem. I think it'll only take about 10 minutes. Could you help me? How long does 10 minutes usually last? It lasts all day. It makes 3 trips to Lowe's. It just never ends. And so you've set aside this time. I need time to rest. It doesn't always work out that way. So keep in mind, Jesus has crossed the Sea of Galilee and climbed this mountain to just spend some time alone. Verse 4, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. It's spring. Therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him. The last thing Jesus needed was the first thing Jesus received. More people. And he looks at the crowd, and with the typical Jesus heart of compassion, he turns to Philip and he says, oh, Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? You ever study the questions of God? That would make for an interesting study. To just look at the questions that God asks us. You know, the first question God ever asked was in the garden. In the book of Genesis, when the scripture says he called out the name of Adam and he says, where are you? That's a question. Did God ask that question in the book of Genesis because he didn't know where Adam was? Did God ask that question in the book of Genesis because God needed information? God doesn't ask questions because he needs information. God asks questions, not for his benefit, but for ours. And it's the same with the questions of Jesus. Philip, where are we going to get bread for all of these people? He's asking that question in order to grow the faith of Philip. Because the text says he already knew what he was going to do. I don't know how many people you fed at Thanksgiving, but I bet you didn't feed 5,000. Now, maybe it felt that way. I don't know. But 5,000 people is a lot of people. There was a Bible class, and the teacher was talking about the feeding of the 5,000, and one little boy spoke up and said, well, why didn't they all just go to Chick-fil-A? And the little girl spoke up, and she said, because it's closed on Sunday. These kids, the kids are great. They're great, you know. I was teaching a Bible class one time. The teacher, something happened, that child got sick or car trouble. I don't remember. Anyway, last minute, I wasn't teaching that particular quarter, and so I said, I'll go. What grade is it? And they said, 4 and 5-year-olds. And I thought, oh, this is great. So I go with 4 and 5-year-olds off the cuff. I'm sitting down on the floor with them, and we're talking about, and I just talked to them about God and things like God is everywhere. That was one of the things I taught. God is everywhere. And I said to the kids, I said, hey, can anybody name some place where God isn't? This one little boy raises his hand. I said, you know somewhere God isn't? He said, uh-huh. I said, where's that? He said, New Jersey. I said, New Jersey? He said, yeah, my dad went there on a business trip, and he came home and told my mother it's a God-forsaken place. I said, well, I've been to New Jersey, and God's there too. God is everywhere. The point is, kids, you never know what they're going to say, you know? Jesus didn't ask questions because he didn't know the answer. Jesus asked questions for their benefit. Verse 6 says, he was saying this to test Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. He wanted Philip to say, with God all things are possible. He wanted Philip to say, Lord, we have been with you long enough to know you can do anything. We have watched you work miracles. We have watched you heal people. We know, we believe in you. But Philip answered him in verse 7 and said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. I'm thinking Philip probably looked at Judas. And in my mind, I'm thinking Philip looked at Judas and said, how much we got? Because Judas, after all, was the treasurer. And the answer comes back to Jesus, not enough. And that's when optimistic Andrew spoke up in verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here who has 5 loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for all these people?" Optimistic Andrew brought this kid to Jesus. He found a food source. But optimism has a way of meeting reality. You see, the problem was Philip looked at the purse and said, "We don't have enough." Andrew looked in the pantry and said, "We don't have enough." But neither of them looked to the one who was enough. Neither of them looked to Jesus. And so in verse 10, Jesus said, "Have the people go away." Is that what he said? Have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves and gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated, likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. Now this was a buffet. Verse 12, when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost." No wasting of food here. Verse 13, so they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. 12 baskets. Every disciple is carrying a basket of leftovers. And every disciple is walking, carrying this basket. And I'm thinking they're probably scratching their heads. How did he do that? How did he? Well, we know how he did that. In verse 14 ends, "Therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, said, 'This is truly the prophet who has come into the world.'" Okay. Let me leave you with 5 lessons we learned from home. 5 lessons, I think, to take home. You ever go to a restaurant? You ever notice the size of the servings at restaurants? It's more than you can reasonably eat. And so a lot of times, "Can I bring you a to-go box?" And so we get a to-go box, and there's our lunch for the next day, right? And so we get a to-go box, and we put the leftovers in the to-go box, and we take them home with us. That's really how a lesson should work. There needs to be some application. There needs to be some relevance that we put in our little mental box and take home with us as far as application. If a preacher doesn't give us some take home, then I think it's not very practical. So I'm going to give you 5 things to put in your take home box. Quickly. Number 1, I want you to write this down. Compassion. Compassion trumps convenience. Compassion trumps convenience. Jesus loved people when it wasn't convenient to love people. He wanted rest time, he wanted prayer time, he wanted grieving time, and what he got were people who infringed upon his time. But then again, serving other people isn't always convenient. You ever look at the word sacrifice? Do you ever really think about what that means? It means that you and I give up something in order to serve somebody else. I think we need to slow down. I think we need to slow down to the point that we can be moved with compassion like Jesus was moved with compassion. Compassion trumps convenience. Number 2, God can turn a bad situation into a good opportunity. God can turn a bad situation into a good opportunity. We read that in Romans 8 and verse 28. God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. Now, we can look at that and we can talk about that principle in view of the plan of God for the salvation of man. We can back up and look at it from a very broad perspective. How God calls things just to work together for man's good. But I tell you what we can also do. We can zoom in to your life and mine. You ever study providence? I don't understand providence, but I believe in it. It's God's way of providing for you. sometimes in ways that you don't understand at the time. The question has to be, am I available for God's providing? Am I available for God's providence? Moses said, Lord, here am I. Why don't you send somebody else? Isaiah said, here am I. I'm available. Send me. God can take what seems to you to be a bad situation, and he can turn it into a good opportunity, but you have to be available. Number 3, God can take your little and make a lot. 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's not much. But isn't it interesting that God has a way of multiplying? God has a way of multiplying your little. God can take your time. God can take your talent. God can take your opportunity. God can take your little and make a lot. I never have been good at math. You know, there's math and science people, there's English and history people. I'm English and history. And for all of you who are math and science, I'm thankful for you. Glad, because I never got it, you know. I was lucky to get through algebra with a C- or whatever it was. Whew, I was thrilled to death. I'm not good at math. But when it comes to this, I don't have to worry about math. What we have to do is let God do the math. And God's a lot better at doing the math than you and I are at doing the math. Let God do the math. God can take your little and make a lot. I don't have to understand how he does it. I just have to, as we said, be available. Number 4, nothing is too big for God. Nothing is too big for God. There's giants in the land. Can't take it. Yeah, there's always going to be giants in the land. There's Goliath standing there defying the armies of Israel. Yeah, there's always going to be a giant out there. There's the Jericho walls. We can't go under them. We can't go over them. Well, why don't you try going around them? You know, like 13 times. Nothing is too big for God. Nothing. 5,000 people. Philip, where are we going to get enough food for all these people? Nothing is too big for God. And last, our faith has to conquer our fear. Our faith has to conquer our fear. We're just like Philip. We're just like Andrew. We think the solution is up to us. And it's not up to us. Why don't we let him take care of it? You know, Philippians 4 and verse 13. I've heard so many people misquote that verse. I can do all things. I can do all things. Yeah, it says that, but it doesn't say it. Because you're stopping too soon. I can do all things through Christ. Jesus is great, not me, not you. The only way we can do all is through the one who is us. You got those 5 take-homes? There it is. Compassion trumps convenience. God can turn a bad situation into a good opportunity. God can take your little and make a lot. Nothing is too big for God, and our faith must conquer our fear. Any of those 5 things? Maybe. You need to take home. You know, the marvelous thing about Scripture, whether it's the miracles of Jesus, the parables of Jesus, or any of them, the marvelous thing is how applicable and relevant they are. If we would just take the message and lift them off the page and bring it down to where we need it, it is life. As John said when we finished his book, I've written the same so that you we sing a song of invitation. You're not a believer. You're not a child of God. Think about it. Folks here who will study the Bible with you, they'll talk to you about your life and God's plan. love for you. We can help you today in some way. If you're ready to obey the gospel, turn from your sin and confess the name to be married in baptism. Or talk with you later, whatever it takes you to do. Please let us. Please let us. Won't you come?